January 17, 1943, North Sea. The Heinkel He 11-1 bomber droned through the pre-dawn darkness at 12,000 feet, its twin Jumo engines vibrating through the aluminum fuselage with a rhythm the crew had learned to sleep through on long missions. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann sat rigid in the navigator's compartment, his breath condensing in small clouds despite the heated flight suit. Through the plexiglass nose he could see nothing, only the infinite black where sea met sky, erased by winter fog and the absence of moon. The channel stretched beneath them, invisible, cold, indifferent. In 4 minutes, by his calculations, the English coast would materialize from that darkness. 4 minutes until the searchlights began their probing dance. 4 minutes until the anti-aircraft guns opened their mouths of fire. But this morning, something was different. The radio operator's voice crackled through the intercom, tight with confusion. "Herr Oberleutnant, I'm receiving. They're broadcasting our altitude, our exact altitude, and bearing." Hoffmann's hand froze over his navigation chart. The bomber was still 70 kilometers from the British coastline, 70 kilometers from where any observer could possibly see them, where any sound locator could possibly hear them. Yet somehow, impossibly, the British already knew they were coming. What Oberleutnant Hoffmann could not see, what no German pilot could see in those early months of 1943, was the invisible wall that had risen around the British Isles, a wall not of concrete or steel, but of electromagnetic waves, a wall that reached out across the darkness, touching his aircraft with fingers of radio energy, measuring the echo of its return, calculating speed and heading and altitude with mechanical precision. He could not see the stations along the British coast, their tall masts casting radial beams into the sky like lighthouses throwing illumination across fog. He could not see the cathode ray tubes in darkened rooms, where young women in uniform watched green phosphorescent blips crawl across circular screens tracking his bomber's approach with calm efficiency. Directing fighter aircraft toward intercept coordinates, while he was still beyond visual range, still beyond auditory range, still theoretically invisible. He could not see these things, but in 4 minutes he would feel their consequence. This was the terrible mathematics of technological asymmetry, though no such phrase existed in 1943. This was the moment when German operational doctrine built on speed, on surprise, on the cover of darkness, collided with a revolution in physics that had been quietly unfolding in British laboratories since 1935. Radio detection and ranging. RDF, they called it first, then simply radar. The word itself was American adopted by the British in 1943, though the technology had been developing simultaneously in Germany and America in the Soviet Union, each nation racing toward the same principle, that radio waves could be made to see what human eyes could not. But knowing a principle and deploying a system are separated by an ocean of engineering, of industrial capacity, of strategic vision. And in this gap, the war would be won or lost. The German High Command had entered the war supremely confident in their understanding of aerial warfare. The Luftwaffe had been forged in the Spanish Civil War, refined in Poland, perfected in France. Their doctrine emphasized speed, concentration of force, and the element of surprise. Night bombing missions relied on darkness as their primary defense clouds and fog as allies, the vast empty sky as sanctuary. German intelligence knew the British possessed some form of radio detection apparatus. Reconnaissance had photographed the tall masts along the coast. But intelligence reports suggested the system was primitive, unreliable, easily confused by weather or altitude changes. They were catastrophically wrong. What German intelligence had failed to grasp was not the existence of British radar, but its integration into a comprehensive defense system. The chain home stations that ringed the British coastline were not merely detection devices, they were the sensory organs of an entire organism. The information they gathered flowed to Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory, where it was correlated, analyzed, and transformed into vectors and intercept coordinates transmitted to airfields across southern England. Pilots could be scrambled, directed to specific altitudes and headings, guided toward enemy formations they could not yet see. The British had not simply invented a device, they had invented a system, a doctrine, an entirely new way of fighting in 3 dimensions. The Germans had built superior aircraft, faster, more maneuverable, more heavily armed. But they were fighting blind against an enemy who could see in the dark. Oberleutnant Hoffmann had been briefed, of course, on British radar capabilities. Every Luftwaffe crew received the standard warnings: maintain radio silence, vary your approach altitude, use weather fronts for concealment. But the briefings carried an undertone of skepticism. The technology was too new, too theoretical. Surely it could not work with such precision. Surely the British were exaggerating their capabilities, spreading rumors to create fear and caution among German aircrews. Hoffmann had flown 17 missions over England. Only twice had he encountered fighters before reaching his target area, and both times he had attributed it to bad luck, to random patrol patterns, to the statistical inevitability of occasionally crossing paths in the vast arena of the sky. He did not yet understand that there was no luck involved, that every encounter was calculated, directed, deliberate. The intercom crackled again. "Herr Oberleutnant, they're broadcasting our speed now, ground speed, precise to 5 kilometers per hour. The bombardier's voice, younger, less experienced. "How is this possible? We're still over water. There's nothing to see us." How indeed? Hoffmann checked his instruments again, compared them to his navigation plot. Every figure matched what the British radio operator was calmly announcing in English. It was as if they were reading directly from his instrument panel. The absurdity of it struck him with the force of revelation. They were not guessing, not estimating, not using probabilistic calculations. They knew, with certainty, with precision. For the first time in his operational career, Hoffmann felt the cold touch of technological obsolescence. He was flying a sophisticated machine, a marvel of German engineering, equipped with bomb sights that could calculate drift and windage, with navigation systems that could find targets through cloud cover, with defensive armament that had proven effective in dozens of engagements. Yet all of it was suddenly inadequate against an enemy who possessed the fundamental advantage of perception, an enemy who could see him when he could not see them. The British fighters arrived exactly on schedule, materializing from the darkness with their wing-mounted cannons already firing. Hoffmann's bomber shuddered as 20-millimeter rounds stitched across the port wing. The pilot threw the aircraft into a diving turn, but the fighters had altitude advantage, had position advantage, had information advantage. They knew exactly where to look. Within 90 seconds, 2 more bombers from Hoffmann's formation were spiraling toward the black water, trailing fire. The mission was aborted. Those who survived turned back toward occupied France, their bombs still in their bays, their confidence shattered. The radar stations themselves were miracles of improvised engineering. The chain-home network had been constructed in desperate haste between 1937 and 1940. 350-foot steel towers strung along the coastline like an electronic picket fence. Each station transmitted pulses of radial energy at approximately 25 million cycles per second, wavelengths of roughly 12 meters. When these pulses struck a metallic object, an aircraft, a ship, a tiny fraction of the energy was reflected back toward the transmitter. Receiver towers, positioned nearby, collected these faint echoes. The time delay between transmission and echo return gave distance. The direction of the strongest echo gave bearing. By comparing readings from multiple stations, operators could triangulate altitude and track. The system was ungainly, vulnerable to interference, limited in range and accuracy, but it worked. More importantly, it worked consistently, reliably, night after night, in conditions where visual observation was impossible. German engineers understood the principles involved. They had, in fact, developed their own radar systems, the Freya and Würzburg sets that would eventually become crucial to Germany's own air defense network. But German radar development was fragmented, divided among competing services and industrial firms, never fully integrated into strategic doctrine. The Luftwaffe used radar defensively to protect German cities from British bombers. They never fully grasped its offensive potential, its ability to transform fighter interception from an art into a science. The Americans, arriving in Britain in 1942, brought their own revolution. American radar technology emphasized miniaturization, mass production, and electronic sophistication. The SCR-584 gun-laying radar could track aircraft with extraordinary precision, feeding data directly to anti-aircraft batteries. The ANAPS-10 tail warning radar gave bomber crews eyes in the back of their heads. Most revolutionary of all was the cavity magnetron, a British invention that Americans refined and manufactured by the thousands. A device that generated powerful microwave frequency radar signals, enabling smaller antennas, higher resolution, airborne installation. By 1943, American bombers over Europe carried their own radar systems, could navigate through cloud cover, could locate targets by electronic echoes when visual bombing was impossible. This was the world German pilots entered when they crossed the Channel, a world where the sky itself had become sentient, where darkness offered no concealment, where every aircraft was visible to an invisible observer. It was profoundly disorienting. The fundamental assumptions of aerial warfare, that altitude was safety, that clouds were shelter, that night was protection, all dissolved against the reality of electromagnetic detection. Hoffman returned to his base at Soesterberg in the Netherlands as dawn was breaking, his bomber damaged, his formation depleted. The debriefing was tense. The intelligence officer recorded the details with careful precision. Enemy fighters at unexpected altitude, interception beyond visual range, British radio communications containing accurate tactical information. But when Hoffman tried to explain the implications that the British could see them, always, continuously, from the moment they crossed the Dutch coast, he encountered skepticism. Other crews had different experiences. Some had reached their targets without encountering fighters. Some had been intercepted only over the target area itself. The pattern was not yet clear to those examining individual mission reports. Only later, when analysts compiled data across hundreds of sorties, would the statistical pattern emerge. British interception rates were highest when weather was poor, when darkness was complete, when visual detection should have been impossible. The worse the conditions, the better the British performed. The correlation was undeniable once seen, but invisible to individual crews experiencing it mission by mission. This was asymmetric warfare of the most fundamental kind. One side could see, the other could not. And the side that could not see was losing, slowly, mathematically, by accumulation of small defeats that compounded into strategic catastrophe. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe daylight operations over Britain had effectively ceased. The cost was simply unsustainable. Night operations continued, but with increasingly poor results. British night fighters, equipped with airborne interception radar, could find German bombers in complete darkness, could close a firing range guided purely by electronic returns. The Liechtenstein radar sets carried by German night fighters were effective, but the Luftwaffe had far fewer night fighters, and they were increasingly needed to defend German cities against the growing weight of RAF Bomber Command's nocturnal offensive. The strategic calculus was inexorable. Every radar advantage multiplied every other advantage. Better detection meant more efficient fighter scrambling, which meant higher interception rates, which meant more German bombers destroyed, which meant fewer survived crews, which meant declining experience levels in operational squadrons, which meant still higher loss rates in subsequent missions. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Meanwhile, Allied radar technology continued to improve. Ground-controlled interception became more sophisticated. Airborne radar became more reliable. American production ensured that every new aircraft, every new system, incorporated the latest electronic advances. German pilots increasingly spoke of the British Isles as forbidden territory, a technological fortress that could not be breached without suicidal losses. The psychological impact was profound. Luftwaffe crews who had entered the war with supreme confidence in their training, their aircraft, their doctrine, now flew knowing they were visible to an enemy they could not see. Every mission became an exercise in controlled dread. The darkness that should have protected them had become hostile, penetrated by invisible rays that marked them for destruction. Some crews reported the sensation of being watched, of eyes following them through the night sky. It was not superstition. They were being watched by cathode ray tubes in underground bunkers, by operators plotting their coordinates on glass screens, by systems that never slept and never lost focus. The symbolic weight of this reversal cannot be overstated. German military culture emphasized will, leadership, the human element in warfare. Technology was important, but subordinate to fighting spirit, to tactical brilliance, to the quality of individual soldiers. The radar war inverted this hierarchy. No amount of courage or skill could overcome the fundamental disadvantage of being visible while your enemy remained invisible. German pilots were not less brave than they had been in 1940. They were not less skilled. But they were fighting at a systematic disadvantage that bravery and skill could not compensate for. What Hoffmann experienced, what thousands of German aircrews experienced throughout 1943 and 1944, was the collapse of tactical parity. The Luftwaffe still possessed excellent aircraft, well-trained pilots, sophisticated tactical doctrines. But they were fighting blind against an enemy who could see. And in aerial warfare, where speed and position are everything, where split-second decisions determine survival, the ability to see first is the difference between hunter and hunted. The American contribution to radar technology brought not just innovation but industrial scale. British scientists had invented the cavity magnetron in 1940, a device that would eventually be called the most valuable cargo ever brought to America. In September 1940, the Tizard mission delivered the magnetron to the United States, along with other British technological secrets, in exchange for American industrial capacity. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology established the Radiation Laboratory, the RAD Lab, which became the center of Allied radar development. By war's end, the RAD Lab employed nearly 4,000 scientists and engineers, had developed more than 100 different radar systems, had transformed radar from an experimental curiosity into a mass-produced military necessity. American factories produced radar sets by the thousands. Western Electric, Raytheon, General Electric companies that had built radio equipment for civilian markets now turned their capacity toward military electronics. The SCR-584, which would prove devastatingly effective against German V-1 flying bombs in 1944, went from prototype to mass production in 18 months. American engineering emphasized standardization, modularity, ease of maintenance. Radar sets were designed to be repaired by technicians with minimal training, using interchangeable components shipped in standardized containers. This was warfare as industrial process, victory as manufacturing output. German radar development, by contrast, remained artisanal. Individual systems were sophisticated. The Würzburg, in particular, was a marvel of precision engineering. But production was limited by material shortages, by strategic bombing of factories, by the increasing chaos of the German war economy after 1943. More critically, German military culture resisted the full integration of radar into operational doctrine. Radar was seen as a defensive tool, useful for air defense, but not central to offensive operations. The Luftwaffe never developed the comprehensive command and control systems that made British and American radar truly effective. German ground controllers could detect Allied aircraft, but they lacked the communications infrastructure, the standardized procedures, the training, and the doctrine to translate detection into coordinated interception. This was not a failure of German science or engineering. It was a failure of strategic vision, of organizational culture, of industrial capacity. The Germans understood the physics as well as anyone. But they could not match the systematic integration, the massive industrial production, the doctrinal innovation that characterized Allied radar development. They were fighting an industrial war with artisanal methods, and the mathematical outcome was inevitable. By 1944, the gap had widened to absurdity. Allied bombers over Germany carried H-2X radar that could map cities through cloud cover, could identify targets by their radar signatures alone. American P-51 Mustangs escorting bomber formations were guided by ground controllers using radar vectors, could be directed toward German fighter formations with clinical precision. German fighters, meanwhile, were increasingly forced to rely on visual interception, scrambling in response to bomber streams they could detect, but not precisely track, arriving too late or at wrong altitudes. Burning irreplaceable fuel in fruitless pursuit of formations already past their position. The symbolic object of this technological dominance was not a weapon or a tool, but a signal. The constant, invisible pulse of radar waves washing across the European sky, marking every aircraft, every ship, every significant metallic object within range. German soldiers could not see these signals, could not feel them, could not directly perceive them in any way. But they were there, constantly, an electronic omniscience that rendered obsolete all the traditional tactics of concealment and surprise. The sky had become transparent to one side while remaining opaque to the other, and in this asymmetry lay the architecture of defeat. Werner Hoffmann survived the war, though his unit did not. By May 1945, the bomber group he had served with in 1943 had been effectively destroyed, not in a single catastrophic battle, but by gradual attrition by the accumulation of missions from which crews did not return, by the mathematics of unsustainable loss rates. Hoffmann himself was reassigned to training duties in 1944, judged too experienced to waste on missions that had become suicide runs. He spent the final year of the war teaching young pilots navigation techniques that were already obsolete, briefing them on tactics that would prove ineffective against an enemy who could see them coming from 100 kilometers away. After the war, he encountered the technology that had hunted him through the night sky. Visiting a former RAF base in 1950, he was shown a chain-home receiver station, its equipment still intact, preserved as a historical artifact. He stood before the cathode ray tube display, watching the green line sweep around the circular screen, imagining how his bomber must have appeared. A small, bright dot crawling across the display. Its speed and heading measured by women in uniform who had never seen him, would never see him who knew him only as coordinates on a screen. The impersonality of it struck him deeply. He had thought of the war in personal terms, pilot against pilot, crew against crew, human skill versus human skill. But he had been fighting a system, an infrastructure, a technological organism that absorbed individual skill and courage into its vast mechanical process. This was the deeper lesson that German officers could not fully grasp until after the war had ended. They had been fighting not just British and American soldiers, but British and American industrial capacity, scientific organization, systems engineering. Every radar station represented not just a single piece of technology, but an entire supply chain: power generators, telephone lines, trained operators, maintenance crews, replacement parts manufactured by distant factories, training schools producing new operators, engineering teams continuously improving the system. The radar itself was merely the visible tip of an enormous logistical and industrial iceberg. The Germans had entered the war believing that superior fighting spirit and tactical brilliance could overcome material disadvantages. The radar war taught them otherwise. No amount of courage could overcome the systematic disadvantage of being visible while your enemy remained invisible. No amount of tactical skill could compensate for structural technological inferiority. The side with better radar did not win every engagement. Individual battles were still determined by countless factors, by weather and luck and human error. But across thousands of engagements, across the full breadth of the war, better radar meant better outcomes, consistently, mathematically, inevitably. This realization that wars could be won or lost by systems rather than by heroes, by industrial production rather than by individual valor, was deeply alien to traditional military culture. It suggested that the future of warfare lay not in producing better soldiers, but in producing better systems, not in tactical brilliance, but in technological superiority maintained through scientific research and industrial capacity. It was a future that would define the post-war world, where military power would be measured not in divisions or battleships, but in early warning networks, in missile guidance systems, in satellite surveillance, in the electromagnetic spectrum itself. The British operators who watched Hoffmann's bomber on their radar screens never knew his name, never saw his face, never understood his individual story. To them, he was Track 47, a phosphorescent blip moving at 280 kilometers per hour on a bearing of 090 degrees. They plotted his position, calculated his course, directed fighters to intercept. When his formation turned back short of the target, they noted it in their logs and moved on to the next track, the next formation, the next mission. The war, for them, was a sequence of green dots on circular screens, 8-hour shifts in underground bunkers, the continuous translation of electromagnetic echoes into tactical information. This was the nature of technological warfare: abstract, remote, drained of immediate human connection. The people killing you were invisible, might be hundreds of kilometers away, might never know your name or face. You were reduced to a dot on a screen, a target designation, a set of coordinates. The personal element that had defined warfare for millennia. The knowledge that you were fighting another human being, another soldier with his own story and fears and hopes, was attenuated, stretched thin, almost severed. You were fighting a system, and the system was indifferent to your humanity. Yet humanity persisted. Hoffmann remembered the fear he felt when the British radio operator calmly announced his altitude and bearing. The radar could detect, his aircraft could measure its position and speed with mechanical precision, but it could not measure his fear, could not quantify the tightness in his chest, the cold sweat despite the heated flight suit, the knowledge that his invisibility had been stripped away. The radar reduced him to data, but he remained human, remained conscious of his own mortality in a way that no cathode ray tube could register. This tension between human experience and technological abstraction defined the radar war. The technology was impersonal, but the consequences were intensely personal. Every track on a radar screen represented human beings, crews of 5 or 6 or 7, each with his own story, each aware that he was being hunted by an enemy he could not see. The psychological weight of this knowledge was profound. Traditional warfare offered the comfort of reciprocity. You could see your enemy, could fight back, could believe that skill and courage made a difference. Radar warfare offered no such comfort. You were visible, they were not. You could be hunted, They could not. The asymmetry was absolute. Some German crews broke under this pressure. There were reports of bombers turning back before reaching their targets, of pilots claiming mechanical failures that ground crews could not confirm, of men who simply could not force themselves into the sky knowing they were flying into an invisible net. These were not cowards in any traditional sense. Many had flown dozens of successful missions earlier in the war. But the psychological burden of fighting blind against an enemy who could see was unsustainable. Courage can overcome fear, but it cannot overcome futility. And there was something deeply futile about flying mission after mission, knowing the enemy could track your every movement, could vector fighters to your position with clinical precision, could destroy you while remaining invisible themselves. The epilogue to the radar war unfolded across the decades that followed. The technology that had tracked Hoffman's bomber through the darkness of 1943 became the foundation of air traffic control, of weather forecasting, of satellite surveillance, of the vast invisible infrastructure that coordinates global aviation. The same principles that British operators used to detect German bombers now track every commercial aircraft in the world, maintaining separation, preventing collisions, enabling the safe movement of millions of passengers every day. The wartime breakthrough became peacetime necessity, but the deeper legacy was strategic. The radar war demonstrated that technological superiority could be decisive, that scientific research and industrial production were themselves weapons, that victory could be engineered in laboratories and factories as surely as on battlefields. The lesson was learned and applied. The post-war arms race was fundamentally a technological competition. Nuclear weapons, intercontinental missiles, reconnaissance satellites, anti-ballistic missile systems. Each side invested enormous resources in maintaining technological parity, understanding that to fall behind was to accept strategic vulnerability. The radar itself became a symbol of modernity, of the scientific transformation of warfare, of the replacement of human perception with mechanical sensing. The tall masts of chain home stations, visible for miles along the British coast, stood as monuments to a new kind of power, the power to see beyond the horizon, to pierce darkness and cloud, to render visible what should have been hidden. They represented the triumph of physics over geography, of electromagnetic radiation over human limitation. Yet there was melancholy in this triumph. Hoffman, standing before that radar display in 1950, recognized that something had been lost as well as gained. The sky had been made transparent, but in the process it had lost its mystery. The darkness that had once sheltered him, that had once been his ally, had been conquered, illuminated, made knowable. There was no longer any place to hide in the vertical dimension. Every aircraft was visible, every movement tracked, every position recorded. The freedom of the empty sky, the sense of being alone in vast space, invisible, unobserved, had been permanently foreclosed by technology. This was the price of progress. Each new capability brought new constraints. The radar that protected British cities from German bombers also created a world of continuous surveillance, of tracked movements, of privacy eroded by the need for security. The technology was neutral. The same radar that guided fighters to intercept bombers could guide rescue aircraft to downed crews, could direct civilian aircraft away from storms, could serve countless peaceful purposes. But its existence permanently altered the relationship between individual and system, between freedom and security, between concealment and exposure. Hoffman lived to see the world this technology created, a world where no aircraft could cross a border without being tracked, where military movements were visible from satellites, where electronic intelligence could intercept communications from across continents. He recognized it as the logical extension of what he had experienced in January 1943, the progressive erosion of invisibility, the expansion of perception through technological means. the transformation of warfare from personal combat into systematic competition between rival technological infrastructures. In his later years, he sometimes wondered whether the British operators who had tracked his bomber ever thought about the human beings behind the phosphorescent dot on their screens. Whether they understood that every track they plotted represented stories, fears, hopes, the accumulated life experience of human beings who happened to be on the other side of an arbitrary line dividing Europe. He suspected they did not, could not, that the technology itself created psychological distance, allowed the operators to focus on their task without confronting its human cost. This was perhaps necessary. War required such distance, such abstraction, such transformation of individuals into targets. But something essential was lost in the process. The fundamental truth revealed by the radar war was this: in modern conflict, perception is the ultimate weapon. The side that can see more, see farther, see through obstacles that blind the enemy, possesses an advantage that compounds with every engagement. Hoffman's experience flying blind while being watched, hunted by an enemy he could not perceive, was a preview of warfare's future. Every subsequent conflict would be shaped by competition for electromagnetic dominance, for control of the sensory environment, for the ability to see without being seen. But beneath the technology, beneath the systems and the infrastructure and the industrial production, the war remained human. Human beings designed the radars, built them, operated them. Human beings climbed into aircraft knowing they were flying into watched skies. Human beings made decisions, felt fear, experienced the compression of time that comes when electronic systems accelerate the tempo of combat beyond human processing speed. The technology was powerful, but it was not autonomous. It extended human capability without replacing human experience. This was the paradox Hoffman could never fully resolve. The radar war was both deeply impersonal, abstract, mechanical, reducing individuals to data points, and intensely personal, defined by fear and hope, and the intimate knowledge of one's own mortality. The system tracked his aircraft, but he experienced the tracking. The cathode ray tube displayed his position, but he felt the fighters closing in, made the decision to break formation and dive, experienced the relief of escaping into cloud cover. Returned to base carrying the memory of two bombers spiraling toward the black water, their crews becoming casualties in a war fought by machines that saw what humans could not. In the end, the radar did not defeat Germany, but it contributed to defeat, systematically, incrementally, by making every mission more costly, every operation more difficult, every advantage more fleeting. It was one thread among many in the fabric of Allied victory: industrial production, strategic bombing, tactical doctrine, intelligence operations, code breaking, all interweaving to create cumulative pressure that the German war machine could not withstand. But it was a crucial thread, revealing how technological asymmetry could be translated into military advantage, how perception itself could be weaponized. The sky above Europe in 1943 was filled with invisible radiation, pulses of electromagnetic energy sweeping through darkness, reflecting from metal fuselages, carrying information about position and speed, and heading back to receivers that transformed echoes into tactical intelligence. Hoffman could not see these pulses, could not feel them, could not directly perceive the net that had been cast around him. But he knew it was there. He knew he was being watched. And in that knowledge, in that consciousness of being visible while unable to see, lay the psychological core of technological warfare. The understanding that the enemy possessed senses you lacked, could perceive what you could not, could act on information you did not have. This was the new reality of combat in the 20th century, and it would only intensify in the decades to follow. The radar war was not a discrete event, but a threshold, a crossing point after which warfare could never return to its previous form. The sky had become transparent to those who possessed the right tools, and transparency was power. Werner Hoffman understood this, finally standing before that radar display in 1950, seeing himself as the enemy had seen him, not as a person, not as an individual, but as a bright point of light on a circular screen, a target, a track to be plotted and engaged and destroyed. The technology had reduced him to data, but he remembered being human, remembered the fear and the cold and the darkness outside his bomber's windows, remembered the voices of his crew, remembered turning back toward the Dutch coast with empty bomb bays and the knowledge that invisibility, the oldest protection of night operations, had been stripped away forever. The radar saw him, and seeing, in the end, was everything.